often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In today's episode, I will be in conversation with Rachel G. Jordan, author of If the Ocean Has a Soul, a marine biologist's pursuit of truth through deep waters of faith and science. Rachel is a marine biologist and lay theologian whose writing creatively bridges supposed gaps between sacred and secular. She earned B.S. in ecology at Seattle Pacific University, went on to complete an MS in marine biology and ecology at James Cook University in Australia, where her thesis research at the Australian Institute of Marine Science focused on feeding baby corals chemicals as growth supplements. She also has a certification in biblical studies from Bodenseehof Bible School in Germany. Rachel calls herself a self-professed Jesus-loving coral nerd. When not diving or writing, she can be found reading C.S. Lewis, growing wildflowers, and exploring creation with her husband. Rachel, it's a delight to finally meet you, as it were, even if it is only across a video screen. But I've really been wanting to meet you because for several reasons. First of all, reading about your experiences in Australia, because I am an Australian. I grew up in Australia, even though I haven't lived there now for over 30 years. And I fell in love with marine biology when I first visited the reef, the Great Barrier Reef, when I was 11 years old. I mean, there is nothing quite like the Great Barrier Reef in this world.
Oh, it is pretty great.
And isn't it amazing? Yeah. And I wanted to be a marine biologist, but, 50 years ago, I was told it was not a profession that women could really succeed in. So I became a doctor instead, which, I have never regretted, but I still have a huge interest.
Yeah. That's so great. That's a huge deal.
How did you become interested? It is in a lot of ways. But, how did you become interested in the ocean and in marine biology? What led you to become a marine biologist?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And I think it's probably very similar to your story. When I was growing up, my family lived inland, but we would make these periodic trips to the western coast of the United States. So you mentioned that you live in the Seattle area. We would go out there and play around in the tide pools and watch the waves crash along the shoreline and wade out into the water a little bit. And as a kid, it was just so fun. And I especially loved tide pools because you could get access to these creatures that you can't just see when you're, standing and looking out at the water from the surface, but when it's in a pool at your feet that you can sort of poke your fingers into and look around, it's a lot more visible. And so I fell in love with the ocean that way, just all the life that you could find there, the different colors, shapes, weird creatures. It was so fun to me. So that's how I fell in love with the ocean.
Mm-hmm. And what have been some of the challenges that you've faced in your profession, both as a woman and as a person of Christian faith?
Oh, another really great question. It's very much a two-pronged question. So I'll take it one half at a
Uh-huh.
time. I'll address the Christian side first. So, as a scientist, a lot of my Christian community who aren't necessarily part of the scientific community will ask me that kind of thing and say, what kind of pushback do you get from scientists? Or, it must be hard to be a Christian in this kind of setting. And honestly, I have not yet found that to be the case. I've found science extremely welcoming and inclusive and curious even about my faith.
Uh-huh.
Um, from an evangelism perspective, I guess you could say I very much consider it like my mission field. Like that's where I spend my time. It's the people that I am in their lives the most are people who are scientific and very logically minded, sort of experimentally driven, and not necessarily from the faith-based background that I'm from. And so I get to have really unique
Uh-huh.
conversations with people who think perhaps very differently than I do. And the distinct thing that I notice in those conversations is that because of my faith, because of my personal relationship with Jesus, believing in his life, death, resurrection, I have a hope for history of planet Earth, for my own life, and for the future of all created things that someone who doesn't yet know or love God doesn't have. And so when I'm interacting with scientists, particularly environmental scientists who have front row seats to some of the really challenging parts of what's happening to our planet, to creation, I'm able to offer them this hope in a unique way. It's a different perspective than what is typically talked about in scientific communities. So I can be working alongside them in the science. We can be in the field collecting data together or in the lab running a project. But then when we, talk over the lunch table or we stop for a coffee break and we're talking about life, we're able to dialogue about our different perspectives of where everything's heading and how we feel about it. Scientists are humans. They're very emotional creatures. We all are. And so I think a lot of the time, church wise, we can assume, unless we really know a scientist personally, that like they're all these stoic individuals wearing, white lab coats and running experiments. But we're we have feelings and it's hard. It's hard to watch challenges arise environmentally that we're doing our best to sound warning alarms and people may or may not be choosing to listen and they care deeply, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Scientists care deeply about their work and
Uh-huh.
environmental
Uh-huh.
scientists, I believe, care more for creation than your average Christian does because
Uh-huh.
they've chosen to embrace that for their life. It's a very unique perspective. So then getting to bring hope into that equation, into that relationship with
Uh-huh.
non-Christians is, I think, extremely profound. I'm in a very privileged position that way. And um, so that's the scientific side. I don't tend to get much pushback from scientists. I get a lot of curiosity. I get a lot of just almost like bewilderment of like, how are you a Christian? Like, tell me your story. How did this come to be? Like, what possessed you
Uh-huh.
to decide to take that route? Like, why do you believe in God? Like, they have questions like that, and they're very to the point about it. But I love
Uh-huh.
that. Those are some of my favorite conversations. So that's the science Christianity side of things. The woman in science question: what is it like to be female, to be a woman in marine science? It's, I think, very different for my generation than it has been for the generations previously. And what I mean by that
Uh-huh.
is you mentioned that when you expressed curiosity in marine science, that was perhaps suppressed a little bit. People maybe trampled that a bit and did not encourage you, is maybe the most generous way to say it. That has not been my experience at all. And so I feel like while there has been certainly discouragement for women in entering the sciences, I feel personally that we are finally coming to a phase where that is perhaps, at least in marine science, no longer the case. The vast majority of my STEM peers in my marine biology related coursework for both undergrad and grad school were women. Like those classes were predominantly women, and it
Hmm.
wasn't just because of the demographic ratio at the schools I was at. In graduate school, it was an even ratio of men to women in these courses, and women were the predominant group in those classes. So there were days for my job working in the National Park Service that I would, just because of how it worked out, timing wise, I would be working with all women that day. And we had a very even team of people. There were 3 women, 3 men on my smaller field working team. But sometimes, just because of how the schedule happens, all 3 of us girls would be out driving the boat and scuba diving that day. And that was not strange for the national park where I was at. I did not feel any undertone of strangeness to that. And it was fun, being with the girls in the same way that if you were a man and you were getting to work with, 2 other men that you're close with, like it'd be fun. Like there's a different element when you're vibing with the people that you're with on that level. But what I did notice is that when my female crewmates and I would dock
Hmm.
the boat at a more public location where there would, maybe be camping nearby or the public would be watching, we would get a lot of stares. And we would get a lot of people coming up to us afterwards to ask us questions. And it felt at times a little bit like being in a zoo and it was such a juxtaposition because I could be out with, 1 or 2 of my male crewmates and do the exact same thing the exact same way, dock the boat, start unloading gear, and no one would approach us. But when I was with my 2 female peers doing the exact same thing,
Hmm.
there would be people coming up asking us questions, little girls, how do I become a marine biologist? Where did you go to school? Um, Women, moms saying, where does my child need to go to become a marine biologist? Like very specific questions. And then men would come up and be like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it that way? Why don't you try it this way instead? It was it was an experience. Yeah, it was a very different experience in that sense. Like when I have worked in a public facing setting outside of science
Oh,
as a
interesting.
woman,
Yeah.
as a scientist, that is where I feel like, okay,
Yeah.
things aren't
Oh,
quite an
yeah.
even playing field yet. But for
Yeah,
me,
that
my
sounds
experience
pretty
working
typical
in
to me.
science
Yeah.
with scientists has felt relatively even. And again, maybe it's just the generation that I'm in. My mentorship has been relatively equal from
Hmm.
men mentoring me, women mentoring me. I've had both sides, and that I'm speaking entirely from my own experience. I have female peers who would
Interesting.
probably answer
Yeah.
that question differently, but I found it to be um, far less sexism, perhaps, than
Hmm.
one would expect, which is wonderful. That's what we want to see moving forward in the world.
Wonderful. I was very interested, in your explanation of the creation account in Genesis. In you saying that it was not meant to be scientific chronology, which I agree with wholeheartedly, but it is more like poetry. Beautiful way of saying it, and
Um,
trying to help us think different perspective rather than a 7-day creation story that, of course, has caused all kinds of challenges in the Christian world because people believe in a 7-day creation, so they've got to rationalize everything into that perspective. And of course, I think it's part of what leads to a lot of the disbelief of scientists because they can't fit the scientific view into that. But
yeah.
I think that what you talk about, the relationship between faith and science as being almost symbiotic, where science can take faith deeper and faith answers questions that science cannot. It's a lovely way of looking at it. But for you personally, how has science deepened your faith?
How has science deepened my faith? It's hard to tease out exactly which parts of my faith have been influenced um, by an experience I had in nature that wasn't scientific versus scientific. And I guess what I mean by that is science has, it's my vocation, it's the way I spend my time, it's my job. And the majority of my working hours, you could add them up and they mostly equate to science. And that's the way I've chosen to spend my time. And I'm very privileged to do so. But I guess like there's such an overlap for me that I have a hard time picking out like, this is the specific unique thing that science has offered me in my faith. So kind of looking at it objectively, I guess
Mhm.
the wonderful part of how science has deepened my faith on a practical level is that as a field scientist, I primarily have worked outside. So I get to be under the sky,
Mhm.
under the shade of the trees, or out in the sunshine, on a boat, driving the boat, in the ocean, scuba diving, swimming with the fish, and counting corals and doing hands-on things in creation in a very immersive way. So science has opened the door for me to do that, to spend a very
Yeah.
large portion of my time doing those
Yeah.
kinds of things. And as much as I love being a writer, getting to write my book If the Ocean Has a Soul and publish it with Tyndale, that's been an incredible experience. But the majority of my writing time, it's spent inside at a desk, and that process is so different than field science. So I feel like I feel like the way that science has afforded me the opportunity to spend time outdoors and view creation on a very intimate level, like to not just be looking at it as, oh, like, and not that there's anything wrong with approaching creation this way. This is actually a beautiful way to look at creation. But there's a difference between, looking at the tree outside my window and going, oh my goodness, there's a bird in the tree. It's so beautiful, and God made it. That's incredible. Like that, there's
Uh-huh.
a sweetness and an innocence
Mhm.
and an intimacy with that is incredible, and I would encourage people to do more of it. But as a scientist who, did a project on birds for a short stint during part of my education, I look at it and I'm like, that is pileated woodpecker, and oh my goodness, it is currently actively building a nest in that oak tree. And I bet in a couple weeks it's going to have, like 2 to 4 hatchlings. And I will maybe, if I very carefully got up on a ladder and peeked very quietly, I wonder if I could see them. My scientific brain factors in even more potential for wonder at creation. And wonder for me is a mode of praise.
Mhm. I would agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. So how
Mhm.
for
Oh,
you,
you probably don't know, but I actually wrote a book.
what about? Will you tell me
So
about it?
I actually wrote a book called The Gift of Wonder,
Oh, that's right. Yes.
because, recognizing that wonder is, an incredible part of what God has given us, and that we need to kind of enter into the world with
Oh,
wonder.
yes.
And the thing that's been taking my imagination at the moment, I don't know whether you have read, but Lake Eyre, or Erie, or however you want to pronounce it, in the centre of Australia, this great enormous lake that is usually totally dry is filling up for the first
Wow.
time since 1974. And the fascinating thing is, one of my brothers who lives up on the Gold Coast in Queensland said all the pelicans are gone because all of
Wow.
the birds head to Lake Erie to have a feast and to breed,
Wow.
and they come from as far away as Siberia, Japan, and China. And you think, how do they know? It is the most awe-inspiring thing I have read about, and I think entering, science helps to a certain extent to identify some of the things that say
Yeah.
why, um, the these birds are all heading to Lake Erie, but it's like No, nobody understands why or how they can possibly make it from all this distance away to a lake that is only there every 30 to 50 years.
That's
It's
incredible.
anyway, that's getting
Wow.
off the
Oh, I
track, but
love
I think,
that.
it shows that same kind of, yeah,
Yeah,
interplay.
and like
Um,
you're saying with
and
this.
one of the parts of your book that
Oh, sorry. I'll let you keep going.
oh, no, no, it's fine. You are kind of it's not the most perfect, reception, so I
Oh,
think we're kind
bummer.
of having a little bit of trouble here with, the backwards and forwards, which is fine as long as people realize that that's why we keep interrupting
Yeah,
each other
sorry
a
about
little
that.
bit. It's because of the way the recording is going. Yeah. But I was gonna say that not surprised well, no, one of the chapters I loved in your book was chapter 3 when you talk about the choir of creation, um, and how, the rich diversity of the reef, and I think of any ecosystem, and the noises that are associated with it can be compared to an orchestra or a choir. And I think what beautiful imagery that is. And you talk about the rich diversity that is biodiversity that is so important in our world that we need the diversity in any kind of an environment. Um, and so, because each part of creation has its own unique part of the song to sing to provide that beautiful orchestra or choir.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about why, yeah, you think biodiversity is so important, and how do you think that this might be possible in a marine environment? Um, so, yeah, the importance of biodiversity, and particularly in a marine environment.
Yeah. So, just to quickly define biodiversity, biodiversity is the number of different kinds of living things that we see within a given environment. So, you could quantify this through primarily we quantify it through species. So the more different kinds of species you find within a given space, the more biodiverse you say that space is. If there's only one species
Mhm,
that lives in, let's just say, my backyard for a moment, just to define a space, that's not a very biodiverse yard. But if I have, 18 different kinds of grass and 32 different kinds of birds and, two kinds of bunnies and uh, there's a couple frogs that hop around between the puddles. Like that is a much more biodiverse ecosystem than something that just has a couple of different species. And so one of the valuable parts of biodiversity, partly why it matters, is that biodiversity is it strengthens communities. So in the same way that
mhm.
diversity can strengthen human communities, you get different kinds of perspectives and cultures and like
Amen. Yes.
you become a more well-rounded, holistic community when you have that variety. The same thing is true for ecosystems for ecology. So when we're looking at creation and we're looking at a particular ecosystem, a aspect of creation, something like a coral reef or a grassland or a lake or a forest, when we're looking at these ecologies, one of the consistent things we see across all of them is that com- ecosystems that have more diversity are better able to resist and recover from disturbances in their environment. So we could take a
Mhm,
coral reef
mhm,
ecosystem as an example. Coral reefs are tremendously biodiverse. And if they are hit by a disturbance such
mhm,
as a hurricane, they are better able to recover from that kind of disturbance than a different underwater ecosystem, like maybe if you just picked, a random spot on the seafloor where there's just fewer creatures living, fewer different kinds of creatures living, where it's less biodiverse. If a
mhm.
hurricane were to hit there, it's more likely to be impacted in the long term than a coral reef would be, which is interesting because I feel like that is one of those scientific concepts that God intentionally designs very clearly to reveal his character,
Mhm,
of
mhm,
saying to all of his creation, this is what I value. I value the variety. I don't want all things to look the same way at all times. I
mhm. To look the same.
want I want all these different kinds of things with all their different modes of glorifying and praising me to do that
Mhm,
work of glorifying and praising me in their own unique ways. And it very much reminds me of what Paul wrote in his letters where I think it's in First Corinthians. It might be in Romans. I get my Paul books mixed up, but where he's talking to the church and he's
mhm.
comparing us
Me too.
to
Yes.
different parts of the body and saying, these different spiritual gifts that people
Mhm,
have, these different roles that you play in your faith community. You need to not value one more than the other just because one is more visible than the other. So preaching is no more important than the person
mhm,
who decorates the hallway, who is no more important than the person working in the nursery and planning the kids ministry. There's not a hierarchy to these things because all these roles are important and valuable. And when you integrate them together with all their diversity, you get a healthier ecosystem that can more effectively praise God and
mhm,
do his work. And we see the same thing in creation where, in the same way that Paul's comparing the church to the human body of, an eye can't say to the foot, I don't need you, because you wouldn't be a whole body if you were just an eye walking around. It's very much that way with ecosystems as well, and that's why biodiversity matters from both a scientific perspective with the stability that biodiversity creates, and also just the beauty. Let's be honest, biodiverse things are stunning to get to experience and
mhm.
observe, but then
So
also
much more
yeah,
beautiful.
so much
Yes.
more beautiful. But then also from the faith-based perspective, functionally, creation is better at praising God when it is biodiverse. And I'm not saying this to like elevate,
Mhm,
to overly spiritualize one ecosystem or another. I'm saying like this is a principle that God created. Biodiversity matters, variety matters to him. And that's special. That definitely reveals something about
yes.
who he is and how he likes to operate.
Well, I think even with, human diversity, I think ethnic diversity, uh, and, I mean, I'm probably something you may not agree with, but seeing too that even religious diversity
Mhm.
is important, that we learn from each other.
Oh,
I've learned so
absolutely.
much from people of not just other Christian perspectives, but of other religious perspectives. And I think, we need this kind of diversity. Um, and, one of the privileges of my life has been working all over the world. Uh, and I have learnt so much from that rich interaction with people from other parts of the world and that diversity of experience of others that we need. I must confess I'm a little concerned when I walk into a church and every person kind of looks the same.
Mm,
I think we need diversity within a church body too, in the same way that we see it in creation. So,
yeah, beautifully said.
um, just something for people to think about.
Yeah, and that to tie back into what I was
Thank
saying
you.
earlier
Thank you.
about the scientific communities, I find myself in a unique position as a Christian and as a marine scientist because I sort of have one foot in either world and I'm interacting with both communities. And that diversity
Mhm,
that lends me as an individual is so beautiful because I have, the wonder
mhm,
of looking at creation and I can turn that science on and know it in depth and study it and ask all sorts of cool questions. But then as a Christian, I'm looking at it and marveling, and it brings me into greater intimacy with my creator. That the merging of those two perspectives is so special. And as a
mhm.
scientist,
Oh, it
I want
is.
to
Yeah.
bring Christians into the fold of understanding science fundamentally is a pursuit of truth. It's trying to get at what is real
Yes.
and true about the world and trying to understand how things are the way they are. And scientists are very good at answering those questions. And I want to bring scientists into the fold
Hmm.
of being curious about faith and investigating it and being open-hearted with it because, faith is it's the why. It's the not, how things happened or, but it's why things have happened, why things are the way they are. And so it answers a lot. My faith, my relationship with God for me has been a balm to the questions that I have about pain and existence and suffering and death and the future and hope and all these big concepts that science can't answer and is perhaps trying to and struggling to get to a particular conclusion. That's where faith can enter in and transform the story. And so that biodiversity, the
Hmm.
merging of different
Definitely.
perspectives in, as you said, like different even religious perspectives, it can lend a different way of approaching the same questions that we have or the same problems we encounter. And as a community,
Exactly. Yeah.
perhaps by sharing this information with each other, by being tender and charitable towards other perspectives, by learning to love one another better along the way in truth, perhaps we will be a more resilient, stable spiritual ecosystem as a result.
Exactly. Mhm. That's great. Yeah, in fact, you mentioned, the struggles with suffering, which I've also struggled with because most of my career has been spent in third world
Mm.
countries, and having malnourished kids die in your arms really brings up
Ah,
questions
yes.
of suffering, obviously. And, but one of the things that I recognized was rather than asking the question, why does God let this happen? Is to ask the question, where is God in the midst of this? And I found that changing my perspective in that way totally, because I mean, why does God let this happen? In many ways, is an unanswerable
Mm,
question. But when we ask, where is God? It's amazing how many wonderful things we start to see that God is doing in the midst of suffering. Um, and so I think, um, even when looking at the reef and the dying of the reef, which just absolutely is heartbreaking to me, but must bring up some of the same questions. Where is God in the midst of this dying reef? Um, how have you learnt to respond to God's presence rather than to the suffering in what you see?
mm, yeah, where have I learned?
I'm sorry, I know I'm asking some hard
No,
questions
they're
here.
they're wonderful questions. They're the questions worth spending time to really puzzle through. So I love what you're asking.
Mhm,
The way that I experience God in suffering of, I think, any kind, and this is such a tricky topic to talk about because there's so many different avenues of suffering, and everyone has been touched by it in some way, shape, or form. And so, as I answer this, like
mhm,
I want to
mhm,
be sensitive to the fact that other people have experienced different hard things. So this is coming from what my experience has been, which is that when I have asked the question that you did of, okay, God, where are you in this? I have been completely blown away by how he makes himself so evident to me of that he's right there the whole time. And what is
mhm.
happening,
Yes,
the
yes.
suffering has not left his sight. It did not happen without him knowing about it. It is not operating in a vacuum. It's not this isolated thing that he's unaware of or doesn't care about. Like he is in it, more in it, in his presence than I think even the person who's suffering the most in those instances, or the creature that's suffering the most. And
Hmm.
that is, um, I think if you've been able, if you've had the bandwidth to process through your own personal theology of suffering, what I'm saying probably makes a good deal of sense, which obviously you've processed through your theology of suffering and you've taken these things up with the Lord. But what strikes me as important to acknowledge is that many of the people that we deeply care about, many of them perhaps not people who yet know or love God, have not reached a point of being able to even ask the question, where are you, God, in this? Like, it's a beautiful question to ask. It's the question worth asking. I agree with you
Hmm.
completely. But when someone does not have personal relationship with God and they experience suffering, that is not a question that I think they're capable of asking. I think what I have seen in my scientific community is that they tend to get hung up on, if this is happening, how can God, if he exists, possibly be good? And if God
Yeah.
is not good, then what?
Yes. Yes.
If there is a God, do I even want to then try to believe that there is a God? Like that, it becomes an evangelism issue, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It becomes an issue of, it becomes a barrier to the kind of intimacy with God that would then allow them to ask the more worthwhile questions, the the questions that really knit your heart together with the Lord of, God, where are you in this? And I think that's partly why, and
Hmm.
I keep talking about this in terms of personal relationship, but this is why it matters. Like, if you do not have personal knowledge, experience of God's character to lean into or explore when things get really hard in your life, then it changes the kinds of questions you ask. And this is not intended to
Hmm.
sound
It
condemning
does.
at all, but I think it's worth acknowledging that this is why personal relationship, if you profess to know and love Jesus, this is why it matters that you actually are actively working forward in better knowing and loving God and being loved by him, and pressing into that relationship when things are good. Because your theology of suffering
Hmm.
is oftentimes informed by the relationship you have with God at the starting point before pain has yet touched things, and that's tricky. Is this making
Hmm.
sense? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, and often, yeah, I think often we close our eyes and our ears, more our ears, I suppose, to the presence of God within suffering, because we do ask that why question, why does God let suffering, rather than that where is God question. Because I think one shuts us off to the presence of God and the other opens us up to the question,
Mhm.
the presence of God. Even for Christians, people of faith, I've seen people lose their faith because they ask, why does God let this happen? Rather than asking, where is God in the midst of this? And that can, refer to human suffering or the suffering of our planet, which is so
Mhm.
obvious at the moment. Um, and, so helping us to rethink some of the questions we ask. Um, I think is important for us. Getting onto something a little less
Mm.
heavy, I really chuckled when I read the story of your encounter with the giant clams
The
off the
sickles
waters of
clams.
Australia.
Yeah.
Um, Oh, they are absolutely and utterly amazing. But of course, I grew up with some of those stories of people dying. Usually would talk about the
Yeah.
divers who would get their feet caught in a giant clam and would drown. Which I understand has rarely happened in the history of pearl divers. But tell us a little more about your encounters with these giant clams and what you learnt through it.
Yeah. So these giant clams, Tridacna gigas is the Latin name for the species that I was getting to explore.
Mhm.
And they were it's like when you're on the Great Barrier Reef, I don't know how to describe it except that everything is great. And what I mean by that is, in the United States, for example, if you were to go to a coral reef in, Florida, Texas, Hawaii, and go snorkeling or scuba diving, you might, for example, see a sea cucumber, and it would be about the size of a cucumber that you'd find at the supermarket. But if you go to Australia on the Great Barrier Reef and you see a sea cucumber, that sea cucumber will be larger than a loaf of bread. Like, they're big. Everything is just greater. Like, the size,
Yep.
the quantity, the colors are more vibrant. It's just like
Yes.
if you just upped the contrast on the filter of the world, like that is your experience of the Great Barrier Reef. It's just epic, proportionally in every which way. So,
Oh, my trouble was, of course, that, of course, that was the first reef I ever
oh yeah,
saw.
so everybody
So every other reef I
experienced that.
saw, it was so disappointing.
Oh,
Yeah.
it feels so dismal. Yeah. Wow, man, you started with the cream of the crop for sure. So with these giant clams, when I
Yeah.
say they're giant, I mean they're giant. So my arm span is almost it's just shy of 6 feet long if I were to stretch out my arms tip to tip. And when I was measuring these giant clams for a project I was doing, I was measuring them with a flexible tape measure, and I would run the tape measure out along my arm span, um, and try to wrap it from one length of the clam across the top, across the mantle over to the other side, and just barely be able to reach because all of the clams were roughly from like one end to another, um, about that far across. They're giant. Their shells are very thick, probably thicker than the
Mhm.
thickness of your hand, very rough along the sides. But then the body of these creatures is this fleshy, very smooth, soft tissue, which that part of the animal is called the mantle, and they're brightly colored. So most of the ones that I remember seeing were this
Mm.
beautiful, bright tropical blue, or maybe like a purple with like some green in it. But then there were
Mhm.
some that would be, orange or pink. And all of them had they looked like sequins, like neon blue, sparkly iridescent sequins
Mhm.
just scattered over the fleshy mantle of these giant clams. And then there's siphons in the clams that allow them to suck in and blow out water, which is how they feed. They suck in little bits of plankton and
Yes.
nutrients, and then they swallow it up and spit out the water. And so there's sort of this jet effect that happens when you interact with the clam. And so I would snorkel down, and in order to control my measurements of these clam sizes, I needed all the clams to close up so that the numbers were more
Ah,
comparable,
uh-huh.
because it wouldn't work if I measured, one clam and it was open and then the next clam was partially closed and the next one was completely closed. It would have affected my measurements.
Mhm.
So to
Mhm.
equalize these numbers, I had to close up the clams, and so I'd snorkel down and I would tickle the fleshy mantle of the clam, and I don't know how to describe it other than that the clams were laughing because there would sort of if you were in the water, what you would hear is like this gravelly crunch sound as the shell first several inches just shut slightly, and then it would very slowly, almost like this slight grinding, sucking sound. It would just sort of close the rest of the way
Mhm.
very slowly. And in most cases, the shell didn't even close all the way because there was so much fleshy mantle to the animal that the shell couldn't quite encapsulate the whole creature. But what I'm trying to say is, like,
Mhm.
these creatures were phenomenal. It was so fun to experience, so fun to tickle them and to hug them as I measured them with the measuring tape. It was incredible work to get to do. But it's left me entirely bewildered about these stories I hear, most of which I would say are certainly myths. They're not real, of people getting caught
Mhm.
in or
Yes.
dying with giant clams because the clams close so slowly. It's about, 10 to 30 seconds for one of these to close up all the way. And you're having to encourage it, like continuously tickle it to get it to shut the full way. And clams, they're filter feeders. They don't they're not carnivorous. They don't want meat. They do not want to bite your
Mhm.
hand or whatever like that. That would
Yes.
be just as uncomfortable for them as it would be for us. And even if that were to happen, they would just, you know, release, you know, suck in some water through their siphon and open up a little bit and release you. So anyways, those stories, they're like there's some terrifying ones. It's very uh um 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne type of mythology
Mhm.
type stories. Like there's some pretty scary ones. I just can't make sense of it. They're very lovely, sessile, ticklish creatures. So, did you get to see any giant clams when you were
D
there?
Oh, yeah. That I Some of the most amazing things I've ever seen, and it's true, I was thinking as you were talking about this and the stories we hear, I think that we often like to demonize
Mm,
creatures that we don't understand, firstly, and even we like to demonize creatures that are big. I think of some of the stories of whales that we've read too, and yet so many whales are gentle,
yeah,
and yet there are so many stories, in mythology, like Moby Dick of them attacking, and I know there have been occasions when they've attacked, but usually when they've been attacked
yes.
first,
Or
from
their
what I
baby, like their
understand.
baby is
And so
hunted
we
and the
like to
mother lashes out.
demonize these creatures. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and I think that we like to demonize these creatures, or sometimes we like to demonize people because then it gives us an excuse for destroying them.
oh,
And you look at how much destruction has been done of those beautiful, huge clams, partly because people think they're dangerous or
yeah,
because they want to find the little tiny pearl that might be inside them. So,
yeah.
um, I can get passionate about some of
Well,
these
I love
things.
your passion for it. That's wonderful. Yeah, clams can form pearls, but they are definitely not the primary, pearl creators. That would be oysters. But I did, and I put this story in the book because it was
Mhm.
it was
Yeah.
too good to not. There is this bizarre story, and it is real. It is verifiable. I did some fact checking and digging, but there was a fisherman in the Philippines who accidentally got his anchor of his boat stuck on a giant clam, and I'm assuming it probably killed the clam in the process, which is sad. But in the process of
Mhm.
recovering his anchor, he found that this giant clam was containing a giant pearl worth, I don't remember how many millions of dollars,
Oh,
but he didn't understand the
wow.
economic value of this giant clam's pearl, so he took it home and put it under his bed as a good luck charm and kept it there for years until he eventually showed it to people and they discovered what it was worth. But I love that story because that sounds like a myth, right?
Uh-huh.
And I think that's where discernment is
Mhm.
needed when we're hearing stories, and especially these sort of bizarre stories, because there's weird things that have happened, and it's hard to discern truth from fiction sometimes. So, I do not think there are man-eating
Mhm.
clams out there.
Mhm.
I do think there are occasionally very large pearls, but that is not worth that's where, like, doing your fact checking and careful discernment is important. And what a rare instance.
Well, and it's not worth Mhm. It's not worth destroying all those
Oh,
clams in
certainly
order
not.
to maybe find this. Um, and in
And
fact,
I think
one of the
even if you
things
were
I want
to
to,
look at it
um,
I think even if you were to
me
look at it very, like, in a very soulless way, I think even if you were to just value that, like, the economic value that these live giant clams contribute to to the water that they're in from, like, a biological level, the economic value from a tourism level, and then just their intrinsic value. If you were to, like, quantify all that up and put it in financial terms, I think it would far outweigh any value of a potential pearl you might fine inside one. They're far
Mhm.
more valuable to us living than not. I'll definitely say that.
Yes. Well, and that, of course, brings up the issue that coral reefs are dying.
Mm.
And they're being attacked from various things. I mean, even just people touching, the coral, of course, can leads to its destruction. But what do you see as the major issue facing the coral reefs, and how do you feel that we, as people of faith, should be responding?
Yeah, so the primary thing that is killing corals in many, many different ways is increasing ocean temperatures. And by increasing ocean temperatures, I mean something as simple
Mhm.
as the water collectively in tropical locations going up by half a degree to 1 degree to a degree
Mhm.
higher than that, like just a change of a couple of degrees, that thermostat that's getting turned up without getting turned down, and the normal temperature is turned up and becoming permanent and fixed, and increasing beyond that, that is incredibly hard for calcifying organisms, for creatures like corals that pull pull chemical elements from the surrounding seawater to build carbonate-based skeletons. Our own skeletons as humans are made of very similar materials to what coral skeletons are made of. The similarities are astounding.
Mm.
It's a very similar process, but the difference is that corals cannot regulate their own environment, and by that I mean they can't turn down the thermostat if they're feeling too hot. When corals get warm, they get extremely
Yes.
stressed, and when corals are stressed, they go through a process called coral bleaching. And when a coral bleaches, it does not immediately die, but it is far more likely to die than it is to potentially recover.
Mhm.
And recovery is made far more impossible by that increase in the water temperature. Unless the factor causing the stress goes away, the coral will not recover. Additionally, on top of coral bleaching, increases in water temperature exacerbate the presence of disease. So we're seeing an arisal globally in different
Mhm.
kinds of diseases, the prevalence of those diseases and the mortality, the death toll being caused by coral disease. So that's another really big factor. Also, as ocean temperatures increase, we're going to see more storms, more tropical storms, things like hurricanes, typhoons, all that horrible stuff.
Mhm.
And not only is that hard for humans, but it's really hard for these underwater environments. And many times in many cases, coral reefs are fringing reefs. They grow sort of in parallel to a shoreline. And coral reefs are really one of the ways that they're very important for people is that they provide a natural barrier to that coastline to protect it
Mhm.
against storms. The corals are taking a hit for us, but
Yes.
they're getting completely beat up by it. The hurricane has the same sort of destructive impact on a
Mhm.
coral reef ecosystem that it would on your local neighborhood. It's just as intense for the corals as it would be for us.
Mhm.
But the difference is that it takes corals 20, 50 longer years to recover to the same level that they were historically. And so the rebuilding process is a lot slower for corals than in many instances it is for us humans. So the recovery time is longer. And so as we see an increase in storms, we're going to see an increase in physical reef destruction as the result of that. I could go on. There's many other ways that these increases in water temperatures are causing problems for corals, but those are the three big ones that I continuously see are increased stress causing coral bleaching and harder recovery because the stress isn't going away, prevalence of disease and higher mortality rates included in that. So, very high death toll for corals because of diseases. And then, thirdly, that increase in storms, which are going to cause physical damage to reef systems.
So what can we do? How can we help?
Well, I just realized, like, yeah, I answered the first half of your question, but I didn't get to the second half. Like, why should we Christians care about it, and what can we do to help? Um, I think
Yes.
the
Mhm,
first thing obviously is being aware. So here you go. You're listening to this podcast. You now perhaps know a little bit more about
mhm,
corals and why they're important and how they're hurting. So knowing about that and caring, I think that's the big thing that I always come back to. Especially if you live inland away from the ocean, I think it can be really hard to care about some of these organisms the way those of us who live along the coast maybe do, because you're just not being exposed to it the same way. And maybe you've never even gotten to snorkel along a coral reef and see the beauty of that landscape,
mhm,
that seascape rather. And so my encouragement would be, um, consider how you can honor God through your love of creation. And I think this is really personal. This is something to like
mhm.
prayerfully take up with the Lord. But now that you've learned a little bit about reefs, I would encourage you to keep like learning about them, and if especially if you're curious, like, do some googling, do some research, just even like really basic, Google what is the net worth of coral reefs worldwide. I guarantee you'll be surprised. Do some googling of what are some practical
Uh-huh,
things that inland communities can do to help coral reef ecosystems. And I'll list a couple of them here. Some things that you can do that will lessen your human contribution to the increasing ocean temperatures that we're seeing are very simple things. It's like if you have an opportunity to carpool, take it. Just less driving around, burning of fossil fuels, even just a little bit, it does make a difference. It will add up. So that is a very practical thing you can do. Um, Being aware of how much water you use, how much electricity you use. Those are very practical things. And not only will the environment benefit from your awareness, but your own budget will benefit. So if you can make sure you turn off a light when you leave a room, or turn off the water when you're in the middle of brushing your teeth before you rinse, just those simple things. Again, they're small, but they add up. And I think they're pretty doable. If you are in a community where infrastructurally you're supported to be able to recycle, that's fantastic. I highly recommend it. If you're not, do what you can to reuse objects. So there's a lot of single use plastics, and plastic is another one of those big issues that's contributing to pollution and affecting reefs and stressing corals. It contributes
mhm,
to coral bleaching. So I think just in general, like, trying to see if you can use something more than once, especially if it was designed to be single use. So some ways you could maybe do this are like plastic wrap, I find is a big one. I've experimented with using cloths to cover things instead of single use plastic wrap. Or if you use
mhm.
Ziploc bags, that's totally fine. I use them too. But take the 30 seconds to wash the bag when you're done with it and use it one or two more times before you toss it.
Yes.
If you're going to the grocery store and you have, you know, a satchel, some kind of a non-plastic bag, like if you have a cute beach tote, take it to the grocery store with you. Put your groceries in that and check out. It will save a couple plastic bags and it will help marine ecosystems. And what I want to express too is that ecosystems are highly connected. And so while you might feel like, oh, like this plastic bag isn't ending up in my local landfill, but how is that actually impacting corals? My encouragement to you would be things add up, the small things add up, and everything is interconnected. While it might not seem like a plastic bag in your local landfill would hurt corals, there is so much connectivity to our planet, and that is by God's design. So chemicals are constantly being cycled through our environment. As part of my graduate school research, I did some work with this sulfur molecule called dimethylsulfoniopropanate, and it was wild to me to track its arc through the globe from from coral skeletons all the way up through into the atmosphere and then back down again through rain and then back into the ocean. And then there's like a way that humans factor into that. It's wild. There's some really interesting things with our planet that we're still learning
Yeah.
about. So just recognize that things are connected. And even if what you're doing doesn't feel like it's making a direct impact, it is making an impact. So just that awareness. And, it doesn't hurt to keep doing research along the way, but those are hopefully some practical tips that can help contribute to it. And the last thing
That's
I'll say
great.
to this is just
Well, and
like
this is,
like
yeah, sorry.
prayerfully considering what God might have you do. Like talk about it with him. God loves us and he cares about his creation. He cares about your life. And so if some of this is hard for you, that's okay. But just talk about it with God and be like, Lord, here's where I'm at. Here's what I feel like I should be doing or I shouldn't be doing, or like ask him to guide you through the process and give you discernment and to help you come up with doable things that work for you and that will also continue to honor and glorify his character as expressed through creation. I hope that helps.
Wonderful. Well, and I think this is a wonderful place to end at, Rachel. I just wanted to say, though, as we do end, that I have really enjoyed reading If the Ocean Has a Soul. You write very well. You have a very entertaining way of telling stories. And so I think it's an important book for people to read, not just because I'm passionate about some of the same issues that you are, but just because I think it really is a very important book. So thank you very
Oh,
much
thank you,
for writing
Christine.
this, and I hope that it does very well for you.
Oh, thanks. It's been such a fun journey.
Okay. In this conversation, Rachel Jordan and I explored the intersection of marine biology, faith, and environmental conservation. We discussed personal journeys into marine science, the challenges faced by women in the field, and the importance of biodiversity in ecosystems. We discussed her book, If the Ocean Has a Soul, and some of the tension she has felt between faith and science. The conversation also highlighted the threats to coral reefs and practical steps individuals can take to contribute to conservation efforts, emphasizing the role of faith in understanding and responding to environmental issues. In the next episode of Liturgical Rebels, I will be in conversation with Alan Roxburgh, a pastor, seminary professor, and mentor in leadership and missional transformation, who has written 13 books on missional leadership and cultural change. In his work, he addresses questions of church and mission, convinced the Spirit is fermenting a movement of God's people that can't be contained in narratives of renewal, reform, or fixing existing systems. Alan was born in Liverpool, England, but now lives in British Columbia, Canada. When not traveling or writing, he enjoys mountain biking, hiking, cooking, and hanging out with his wife Jane and their 5 grandchildren, as well as drinking great coffee in the Pacific Northwest. I am Christine Sine, the author of Celtic Advent, Following an Unfamiliar Path, and of The Gift of Wonder. My other books include Digging Deeper, The Art of Contemplative Gardening, and To Garden with God. I also write regularly on Substack. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.